So usually the first part of one of my old versus new series would only compare the first episodes of each adaptation to each other in order to demonstrate the overall problems I have with one of them, and then I would go on to point out these problems over and over again as my already inconsistent upload schedule continues to get worse and worse with each installment. But things are going to be a little different this time since, and I'm not exactly sure which version is to blame for this, but what it takes the original Hunter x Hunter anime 3 episodes to cover, it takes the new anime only 1. The reason I say I don't know which version is to blame is that surprise surprise, I like the original Hunter x Hunter anime more than the new one so far, but of its first 3 episodes, one was already completely anime original, which I understand the new version isn't under any obligation to replicate. What's unacceptable though, in my opinion at least, is how the new version handles Gon's backstory at the beginning, by completely neutering and simplifying its dramatic substance, which is a big contributing factor as to why the start of that version is incredibly boring to me. It adequately explains what Gon wants to do and why he wants to do it, but it doesn't fully invest me in his motivations to become a hunter like the old anime does, and nowhere is this more apparent than in its interpretation of Gon's relationship with his aunt Mito. You see, a lot of the emotion from the original adaptation comes from this dynamic, the thought of it eventually ending once Gon goes on his journey, and specifically Mito's own personal hangups which complicate the situation even further. We get a full and detailed understanding of her feelings, not only her fear of Gon growing up too quickly, but also how it's tied to her insecurity that she's not a suitable replacement for the kid's actual parents. Her concern and overprotectiveness of Gon are born from that very insecurity, as well as resentment bred in turn by years of watching her sister grieve over a neglecting husband. However, while she may have sympathetic motivation, she's also nowhere near a perfect guardian, as shown by her willingness to lie to Gon about his father in an attempt to deter him from his ambition of becoming a hunter. In comparison, what do we really know about Mito in the 2011 version? Well, she clearly cares about her nephew and is worried about him as a result, but there's never an indication of that stemming from any deeper reason other than that just being how she feels as his guardian. There's maybe a slight hint of her concern that Gon is growing up too fast like in the old version, but it's not really explored in great detail, and when it comes time for her to show support towards Gon's decision, all it takes is one conversation between them for her to do so. She's much less flawed and three-dimensional than her 1999 counterpart, since all of the more complex elements and deeper psychology of her character are either entirely missing from or substantially watered down in this version in favor of turning her into a much more basic and bog-standard maternal figure. Also, she's way hotter in the old. Now, I'm not saying Basic itself is automatically uninteresting or that Mito has to be this incredibly complex character despite the high probability she's going to be a minor focus in the story going forward, but I do think she has to feel organic and that her emotions should be focused on a lot more considering her relationship and parting with Gon is supposed to be the heart of the story's introduction. I need not look further than the opening scenes of each adaptation to prove my point, whereas the new version starts on a narrator explaining the details of the world to us, then transitions into a scene of a bunch of background characters explaining what the main character is doing and why he's doing it, and then finally gives us a brief glimpse of emotion when Mito shows signs of worry over her nephew, only to immediately shift into a much more lighthearted tone. The old anime puts its emotion front and center right from the get-go, and unlike the new version, it actually lets us sit with it for a while. The desolate sounds of a wind chime that start the whole thing off, the foggy atmosphere and contemplative music combined with the much more effective cinematography to give us a solid understanding of Mito's feelings, the establishing shots that emphasize how dark and empty the bar is as she tries to drink her misery away, the effective cuts and lingers on both hers and Gon's faces that gets you right into their headspace, and the sudden attention given to the photo of Gon's father which adds a nice layer of mystery to the whole thing. All of it makes for a much more powerful and effective tone setter, despite it being far less immediately obvious what specifically is happening here. But most importantly, it's a prime example of what most, if not all, of Mito's scenes do exceptionally well in the old version. They let us truly feel how painful the situation is for her and track her perspective across the entire episode so it builds to a more satisfying development, a privilege the new Hunter x Hunter is only hardly allowed due to the way its first episode is structured. Considering the entire point of Gon catching this fish, aka the master of the swamp, was to convince his aunt to let him take the hunter exam, I find it really weird that both the 2011 anime and manga start out with him almost instantly catching it. It leads to some strange storytelling in my opinion, where what should be the primary focus serious and trial of the first episode happens mostly off-screen, and because of that, we don't get to see any of Mito's initial reactions to Gon suddenly showing an interest in his dad, or his dedication to following in his footsteps like we do in the old version. Stuff like her trying to burn Jing's memorabilia, or lying to Gon about his father being dead in an attempt to hide their family tragedy from him. The dichotomy between her desire to be supportive and her uncertainty as to whether or not this is the best route for Gon to take, along with the gradual process of her coming to terms with it all, is nowhere to be found in the new version. So narratively, the conflict of this introduction comes off as much cleaner, simpler, already mostly resolved by the time it begins. The only moment we actually see of Mito changing her perspective is the conversation I alluded to earlier, where she talks to Gon about his father. How does she react to Gon saying an incredibly concerning and emotionally insensitive thing like, being a hunter must be really great if my dad was willing to abandon his family for the sake of pursuing it? She just smiles and says, "Yup, you're his son alright," and that's apparently all it takes for her to see eye to eye with her nephew. This is what gets me the most, since in both the 1999 anime and manga, Mito reacts very poorly to what Gon says here. Her line about Gon really being Jing's son wasn't supposed to be this moment of triumphant realization, but her honest and gut reaction to something she has a genuine problem with. Considering this version of the episode doesn't even establish that Mito was lying about Gon being abandoned by his dad, I honestly don't even see this scene as heartwarming like it's meant to be. It's just really tone deaf instead. That aside though, this is not the reaction of a genuine person with actual thoughts and feelings. It's something specifically designed for a character to say in order to get the story moving quicker, because I guess the new version is allergic to even having a whiff of conflict. There's no challenge here, emotional or otherwise. What does it take for Gon to get his aunt's approval? One conversation. How long does it take for Gon to catch the master of the swamp after that opening scene, which clearly sets up this trial for the main character to overcome and tells us how hard that trial will be to accomplish? He does it immediately after this in like one attempt, where he moves around and jostles with the thing cartoonishly, and the music is like like it's clearly supposed to be some whimsical, no struggle, Mickey Mouse type shit is what I'm saying. In the original anime, Gon only catches the master of the swamp towards the end of the first episode, after a couple of failed attempts and arguments with his aunt. He gets just enough time to demonstrate his perseverance in the situation, and when we finally get to his moment of success, there's no cartoonish energy or movement. Gon's actions all have a nice sense of weight to them. The music reflects the more perilous tone in this version, and once he finally catches the damn thing, the scene is treated with the level of triumph and emphasis befitting its role in the story, because it's an actual achievement for a protagonist, one he had to overcome leaps and hurdles in order to accomplish, and that'll finally let him pursue his dream and set the events of the entire rest of the story into motion. It is not a completely unceremonious bit of trivia you'd be totally fine not knowing about. Everything just feels so much less like a footnote in the old version, and more like Gon's proper origin story, especially with all the dramatic flair in its presentation and better setups for its emotional payoffs. There's no better example of these things than in Gon's goodbye to Mito, with a beautiful sunset serving as a backdrop, a simple but effective transition from the previous scene, and the incredible artwork that makes for a really memorable piece of imagery in its final frame. The old version also goes out of its way to make it clear when Mito is lying before this point, so when Gon points out her tell, it's much more cathartic of a reveal, since if you go back and look, you'll notice she always averts her gaze when lying to him. Something else you'll notice in the two's first interaction is Gon actually does the same thing. He looks down at the floor as he lies about how he got his wounds, and Mito's able to tell immediately. It's such a small detail that goes unnoticed in the dialogue, but it makes for a nice role reversal in the final scene between them, while also adding extra weight to their embrace as they say goodbye. To me, Mito's action here reads as her acknowledging that her fears of Gon never viewing her as a proper maternal figure were unfounded, because you can see the way the two take after each other, the little habits they've developed together, and how well they know what the other is thinking. The second Gon reveals this connection they have, Mito understands what Gon so beautifully puts into words, that to him, she is the same as his mother, and that is fucking powerful to me. But this episode isn't done making you feel just yet. Oh god, no, because the purpose of its most prevalent piece of imagery has yet to be revealed, and after Gon sets off on his journey, Mito hears those wind chimes finally come into play for one last bittersweet moment, as she goes to check on Gon's room, only to find it empty. What I love most about this scene is it just sits on Mito's reaction, the initial melancholy as she looks around the room, which eventually turns into acceptance as she wipes her tears. No complicated camera work or showy visuals, only a quiet, pure, and authentic representation of loneliness. I can't help but choke up whenever I see this, man. It's just so sad. And after everything is said and done and Mito leaves the room, the episode ends the same way it begins, with some wind chimes ringing all by themselves, but this time with a tiny bit more hope. Legitimately, even if you've already read the Hunter x Hunter manga, seen the new anime, and have no interest in the old adaptation, I'd still strongly recommend you watch this first episode. It's that good. A lot of what I had to talk about was completely anime original and absent from both the new anime and source material as a result, and I know there's a stigma against that kind of stuff, but if you're familiar with my channel, then you already know that from my perspective, the quality of a scene, moment, bit of imagery, or any detail in a story at all isn't really dependent on where it came from. The only thing that matters is how well it serves its role in the narrative, and most of the shit in Hunter x Hunter 1999's first episode was brilliant. It's a lot better than the new version's butchered retelling of this plotline at least, and far more visually interesting to boot. But why? Why is there such a stark difference in quality between these two versions? Well, the simple answer is, it's the people who are working on them. You want to know who the director of the old Hunter x Hunter was? Fucking Kazuhiro Furuhashi, director of most notably the original Rurouni Kenshin, a ton of episodes from the original Ranma 1/2, and more recently the new adaptations of Dororo and the first 2 seasons of Spy Family. He's someone who's consistently proven himself to be one of the best in the industry, and his work on the show reflects that a lot. Meanwhile, if we take a look at the new Hunter x Hunter, we can see its director is Hiroshi Kojima, someone who doesn't really have any notable shows under his belt, either before or after 2011, unless you count The Vampire Dies in No Time or Mashin Hiro Wataru. It's a weird trend with these remakes, whereas the original adaptation busts its balls trying to get big names and make it as likely as possible for the product to succeed, the new adaptations often get shoved onto the plates of newbie directors with next to no experience. Before his work on the new Hunter x Hunter, Kojima was mostly a key animator, with very few roles in any form of directing. Now, that's not necessarily a problem. I mean, Furuhashi didn't exactly start out at the top either, but look at how many episodes of actually notable shows he's worked on, and how many directing roles he's taken on to get his fair share of experience before given the reins to his first big show. In comparison, Kojima's track record isn't nearly as impressive, and it's astounding just how apparent this difference in experience is even from the very first episode. Most second adaptations of manga tend to feel rushed at the beginning, but this is especially true with Hunter x Hunter. I spent so much time talking about the way Mito's character was handled, but at least she was in the first episode and wasn't cut like the flashback of Gon's and Kite's first meeting. Yeah, all of the context for Gon's motivations, how he even learned about his father still being alive and the Hunter exam in the first place, none of that is shown to us here. I think it's likely the 2011 version will eventually get into this bit of backstory, but the fact it isn't shown to us when it makes the most sense to show it to us is really dumb in my opinion. What was it even for? So we could get to the ship chapter a bit quicker and for some reason extend that part of the story? That doesn't make any sense at all. If the logic is we need to cut as much as we can so we can combine 2 chapters into 1 episode, why cut the more important and crucial story information and then add some of your own bullshit to bog down the runtime? That defeats the whole point. But I'm getting ahead of myself, since we still have an entire episode of the old Hunter x Hunter to cover before that. Episode 2 is that anime original episode I talked about at the beginning of this video, and it's good, though unlike the anime original content from the first episode, this feels a bit more unnecessary. But I do get where the old Hunter x Hunter is coming from. Dedicating a full episode to Leorio's character and having him and Gon warm up to each other is a good idea. It makes the heavy character exposition we get on the ship much less abrupt than it is in the new version, while also making Leorio more likable at the beginning. This episode isn't bad at getting us attached to him either. His introductory scene, for example, is handled very humorously, plus it effectively conveys his relationship with money. And while he's very outwardly aggressive and seems like a shallow person on the surface, it's clear he has a secret heart of gold with how many times he feels compelled to save Gon from slavery. This episode even gives us a little sneak peek of Kurapika and some potential insights into his abilities. It's pretty fun. The problem is, the objective the characters are given in this episode feels more like a detour than a natural progression of the story. Also, the pacing is a little awkward. It spends too much time in the Leorio doesn't want to be bothered by Gon phase before they actually start working together. There's the sequence where Gon is stalking this guy all over town looking like a psychopath, and eventually a moment of realization that Leorio's not gonna get away from the kid. And I thought, okay, well that was a cute little transitional step in their relationship, so they're gonna start talking to each other now, right? Well, no, for some reason this part just keeps going with the scene of a thief stealing from a shop, and Leorio steals from that shop as well, and runs off, and Gon finds him, but then a thief steals Leorio's briefcase, and Gon has to get it back for them, and then they finally talk, and then they split up again, only to reunite later on anyways. It's just a lot clunkier than it needs to be, and I think it's because the writer of the episode didn't have enough ideas to fill up its runtime all the way through. The second half of the episode is literally just the characters finding ways to kill time until the boat for the hunter exam leaves, and while it's not as aimless as the first half, it still kind of feels like a waste of time. The plot itself is okay though, using the captivity of these fox bears and Gon's empathy towards animals to sort of challenge his simplistic view on hunters, though I do think it would have been more interesting if this guy was actually a hunter and not just some poser instead. Also, while I'm glad these animals eventually get the freedom they deserve, I can't help but worry as Gon and Leorio just barely make it onto the ship at the end of the episode, those animals might violently kill a bunch of people on their way back home. So overall, this episode is definitely a step down from the first, but if its main purpose was to sell the audience on Leorio as a character while simultaneously sneaking Kurapika's introduction in there, I think it served that purpose well, and is even something the third episode continues to build on. From the very beginning of this episode, you can tell these two are leagues above the rest of the applicants on the ship. They have similarly unimpressed reactions to things the others find interesting, and are the only ones outside of Gon to catch the captain's eye before the storm hits. Their personalities are also often juxtaposed against each other in this version, to give us a good idea of A, what Kurapika is like since he's still a mystery by this point in the story, and B, what their general dynamic would look like, with Leorio being this aggressive, grumpy asshole, and Kurapika being more nonchalant. This gives the audience ample time to not only form their own opinions on the two of them, but also develop a natural sense of intrigue and curiosity over them. The old show eases us into the idea of these characters becoming mainstays by sharing their perspectives and framing them as much more competent than their peers. It gives them just enough time to breathe after that point before they're forced to tell us all about their motivations. In comparison, the new version sort of just spawns them in out of nowhere after a while, and almost immediately after their introduction, they feel the need to exposition dump. It's like, geez dude, I didn't even know these characters existed until now, at least buy me dinner first. That baseline interest just didn't have enough time to grow in the new version. On top of that, I think the old version of the scene is way better at building tension between Leorio and Kurapika. In the new version, Leorio's anger is mostly played off as an obnoxious joke, with him just freaking out in the background as Kurapika ignores him. In the old version, however, the camera specifically focuses on him during breaks in Kurapika's speech, and makes him look a lot more menacing from the start. That, along with how much darker and quieter the room is in this version, creates a more serious tone than in the new one. You can tell when Leorio speaks here that he's genuinely mad, and the way his face is zoomed in on over time is a great indicator of his frustration with the situation slowly boiling over. There are also more individual shots of Kurapika's face, his constant calm frequently interrupting and serving as a means of disturbing the authority Leorio is trying to establish. At one point in this version, Kurapika even cuts him off when he tries to speak, adding to all the disrespect Leorio feels he's being treated with. So while it's still not justified for Leorio to lose his temper here, it's much more natural of a follow-through, especially compared to the sudden tone shift in the new one. Whenever Leorio or Kurapika get angry or into an argument with each other, the camera makes a point of showing Gon paying close attention to them. There's even a moment where the show deliberately pulls away from the two while in the middle of a full-on dialogue to solely focus on Gon's reaction, and Gon reveals exactly why this is the case at the end of this scene when he references something Mito told him before. If you want to know someone, know what makes them angry. The way Gon internalizes this piece of advice is visually demonstrated in this scene, and actually has an interesting impact on how the audience views things throughout it. It draws us into the moment a lot more, putting us directly into Gon's shoes and having us figure out what exactly makes these two tick at the same rate as him. Whereas the new version of the scene feels stilted, slightly lacking in actual character, and unwarranted from a narrative perspective, the old version of the scene is strangely interesting in how it tracks multiple different characters' perspectives without it ever feeling like one is being neglected over the other. It makes the climax and resolution to this episode a lot more engaging to me. Seeing these two put aside their differences is more impactful when those differences are actually made known to us in interesting ways. Plus, as a side note, the way they end up working together to save Katsuo and Gon from falling overboard actually required both of them to be there to help, unlike the new version where if only one of them grabbed Gon's leg, they would have been fine still. This isn't really a big deal though, the point is the same regardless. They work together to save Katsuo. Speaking of, both adaptations actually try expanding on Katsuo as a character, but their respective interpretations of the character are pretty opposite to each other. Whereas Katsuo is just a cool guy in the original adaptation, version, he's more of a stumbling wimp in the new one, even if he does have some hidden talent. And because I'm biased, I gotta say the old anime's approach is more appealing to me. Honestly, it's not so much I have a problem with the idea of Katsuo being the way he is in the new version, it's more that he feels so artificially placed into his setting. I mean, this isn't just any old ship, it's one that has to continuously weather storms so vicious they're used to identify and weed out any applicants who don't have it in them to take the hunter exam. So why would a person like Katsuo, who's very outwardly pathetic, be a part of its crew? It clearly wasn't because of his hidden talent, because the captain was surprised to see him doing so well. So was he like randomly selected or something? For that matter, why is every other crew member so terrible at dealing with the storm? Shouldn't they be used to it by now? They have to do this every year for the hunter exams, right? It's almost as if the writer only gave them weak stomachs to make Katsuo look more impressive by comparison, but that kind of thing doesn't work when it's so obviously manufactured, unless the entire crew is made up of new recruits, in which case, why did anybody think it was a good idea for these guys to participate in proctoring the applicants of the hunter exam? This wouldn't be that important though if the new anime wasn't clearly trying to copy the old anime by adding these scenes of Katsuo in to make you care about him more so you'd feel a bit more invested when he eventually falls overboard. But for the reasons I've just went into, he really fails to leave an impression on me in this version. The old version of the character just makes much more sense to me, since he actually seems to be a good fit for his job. Plus, I think it's pretty funny considering how irrelevant he is in the manga, just how much of a badass he turned out to be here. His character is also a great example of the way this part of the hunter exam is expanded on in the old anime. I found it a little underwhelming that the test used to disqualify all the weak links among the applicants is just, do you get seasick? Then get off my ship! Okay, that's clearly an exaggeration since the situation is very treacherous, but it's such a specific scenario that it completely overlooks a person's general aptitude. Are you telling me that someone's ability to endure in this one situation is more important than their actual skills in combat? What happens if someone like Kurapika, who's very clearly qualified to become a hunter, just had a slight problem with motion sickness? Does that mean he'd fail before even getting to the first stage of the exams? What a stupid system! Katsuo directly addresses this issue in the old version by picking a fight with one of the applicants, which results in that guy getting tossed off the ship after losing. You know, it makes the test seem more substantial than it does in the other versions. This isn't even the only scene that does that either. There's this moment where one of the crew members drops a barrel on top of Leorio's head, and it's practically stated to be an intentional action designed to test him, so when the captain of the ship reacts to Leorio's ability to shake off the attack and Kurapika's ability to dodge the broken pieces, it's clear things like this are happening all over the ship to see if the applicants are qualified for battle or not. Also, for how much stock the new version seems to put into the ship test, it's kind of weird we don't see how any of the main characters actually deal with the storm while it's happening like we do in the old version. By the time this whole test is wrapped up, it feels a lot more like an obligatory transitional step than a genuinely interesting introduction to two of the show's main characters, and I don't really like that. So it should come as no surprise to anybody who's watched this far into the video that I find this introduction to be a lot better and more entertaining in the old anime. It has a better foundation and emotional backbone, so far coupled with competent direction and writing that makes every character's presence memorable, which makes for a much stronger start to the story than the new ones in my opinion. But again, this is only based on each version's introduction, so maybe my opinion will completely change by the time I finish the hunter exam arc. I mean, given my track record, it probably won't happen, but first time for everything, I guess. Special thanks to Omar AS for providing sources for credits, which I will continue to use whenever relevant, and subscribe if you like the video.